everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. If you listen to last week's episode, you know I've been terrified. I had a brush with COVID, and after, I would say, 2 PCRs and 8 or so rapid tests later, I am negative. Whew. All right. So, I guess that was a little bit of a cliffhanger from last episode to this episode. Ooh, this is a good one. This is Damian Abraham of Fucked Up. And if you don't know who Damian is, why don't I read you his bio right now? Originally from Toronto, musician Damian Abraham has been playing in punk bands since he was a tween. In 2001, he formed Fucked Up with Mike Halachuk. I think I pronounced his name correctly, I hope so, and has been the lead singer ever since. They've recorded 6 albums and dozens of EPs and other recordings on labels like Arts and Crafts, Merge, and Matador. Damian is also the host of the interview podcast Turned Out a Punk, which has featured many of the same wonderful guests you've heard here on Beginnings. Fucked Up's latest album, One Day, was just released last week on Merge, and like everything else they do, it's great. This was just a lovely time, even though Damian was coming in from a emotionally fraught place. Their 18-year-old, I believe, cat had just passed away earlier that day, and I had said, hey, if you want to reschedule, I'm so happy to do that. You know, I know what that's like, and he said he would rather have something to distract himself, and so we just had a very lovely conversation. It covers all the things that we cover here on Beginnings, everything from childhood to emotions and creativity and all that kind of stuff. And I knew Damian was a cool person from listening to his podcast, so he exceeded expectations. And I think this is a good talk, and I hope you like it. And if you do, why not check out the back catalog of the show? I've been doing this for 13 years now, and you know what? We talk about in this episode Sonic Youth and Fugazi and Superchunk. Why, I've talked to Thurston Moore and Ian Mackay and Mac McCawn. Why not check out those episodes? If you like what you hear, why not subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from? Got some very cool episodes coming up, including Alina Lowensohn, who you might know from a ton of Hal Hartley films, Emma Pates from the sadly just canceled Pennyworth. She's wonderful in that. Farrell Dalrymple, the great comics artist, indie comics artist, one of the founders of the Meat House Group in New York, AV Tear. So stay tuned for those episodes. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Andy Beckerman, my free philosophy Substack, theslowdystopia.substack.com. I put out a new essay every, 3 or 4 months or so. The concept is basically that the Enlightenment died in the early part of last century, and we're just living in its corpse. And what does that mean? I try to make it pretty accessible. So check that out, and thanks for listening to the show. You know what? Without any further ado, why don't we just get into it? This is so fun. So please, put your hands together for Damian. Are you telling me that writing about grief in 2023 as a large thematic thing that our entire society is going through is like that's a common theme that we're all dealing with right now?
Weirdly, I don't think it was like even writing about grief so much as writing about gratitude, which I guess is sort of themes we kind of were hinting at when we were writing with David Comes to Life. It's like about sort of this idea that you grieve and you lose things, but the idea is that that is part of the human experience, and that is sort of the great tragedy, but also the great gift of life is that everything has stakes and every relationship has stakes that ultimately we are not in control of. I think, though, when we were writing it in David Comes to Life time, it was very much like, not that we hadn't experienced loss as Mike and I specifically, as the main two guys writing lyrics on that record. But I don't think we had experienced it in the way we had experienced it this time around writing it. So I think, this time when we're writing the record, it's coming from a very real, literal place. Whereas last time it was coming from a sort of more ethereal, sort of theoretical kind of place.
Did you have that intention in mind? And I asked that because when I was in a band a long time ago, and I was very emotionally repressed at the time. And so all my lyrics, the emotion had to be buried like beyond like even like pavement, beyond like any kind of like abstraction of like anything, because like I couldn't be vulnerable. I couldn't let anyone know what I was feeling. And so like you're like almost just like the most abstract poetry at times. And so I'm always curious, like, and I think about this too with like script writing now, where I'm like, I have an intention in mind for what I want the themes to be of something, but then I write it and then it just like, it's whatever it is. And I'm curious if like do you mold when you write like lyrics, do you mold it? Like, do you like, I have this intention, I'm going to specifically write this song and then that's how it turns out? Or do you just kind of like let it happen and then it's like, oh, that's what I was feeling?
It depends, because like David Comes to Life, it was like we had to write to certain parameters because we had a script kind of to follow. With this record, and I guess Glass Boys, there wasn't any sort of set parameters, but there were certain things I wanted to say this time around that were sort of self-imposed. So I knew going in that I wanted to write songs on certain themes, and that evolved over the course of kind of like the pandemic as I'm writing these lyrics. But there were, I was almost like going through the songs and kind of playing around with lyrics, and then all of a sudden being like, okay, this will be the one that I want to do about this topic, or this will be the one I want to do about this topic. And it was almost like them finding themselves in my mind, more than me kind of assigning it. But then at the same time, I did feel like there were things that I, had to get off my chest. And I guess it was true with Glass Boys too. There were things that I was like, definitely wanted to write about with Glass Boys. It just, I guess the difference was Glass Boys, it felt like I was sort of doing this on this sort of self-imposed, like fatalistic, this could be my last record for X, Y, and Z reasons. Whereas this time around, it felt like it might be the last record because music might stop, because there were times where there was like no more music. And it's like, if there's, we're a non-essential service if there ever was one. And in a time of essential services, are people ever going to go back to wanting those, frivolities?
Okay, let me throw this at you because it's something that I have struggled with as all the structural, as COVID, as climate change, as, the strip the copper out of the walls capitalism phase that we're in, as all these intersecting crises kind of intensify. There's the phrasing. As they intensify, I have had this struggle where I'm just like, are the things that I do, or is art in general, is it a non-essential service in the sense of like, are we going back to a kind of mentality where it's just like, well, I just got to get food and I just got to have shelter and that's it? Or is it actually, I don't want to be self-aggrandizing. That's the thing, where I don't want to be like, well, of course it's art. We have to have it elevates everything. Like, I don't mean it like that, but I mean like, people got to fucking distract themselves in some way and find joy and other kinds of ways to express emotions in this hell pit of terror that we all kind of been dumped in the last like 40, 50 years. So I guess that was a long preface because I'm just curious, like, do you actually believe that, or is it just like, where is that coming from for you?
It depends what phase in the pandemic you were asking me. There were times where you couldn't walk down the street without the other person crossing the street to avoid coming in contact with you, because we were seeing diagrams about how you're literally spreading this infection that no one knew anything about out your ass as you're walking away from someone. Like, it's coming out of every orifice in your body. And when there was sort of this sort of great unknown, like, what is this going to be? You know, like, and at that point, like, yeah, like it did feel like maybe we're going to go back to just the food and lodging thing. But I think, you know, like we're the type of music that we do, it is the most specific form of entertainment, like musically you can find, or not the most, but it is a fairly niche type of entertainment. And it was sort of this idea of, in this sort of period of just sort of mass, you know, strip the copper out of the walls, capitalism, as you put it, are we going to just get squozen out as a band? You know, like we can't advertise on Google anymore, or we can't use YouTube anymore because of our name. Like it just feels like the thing that made it possible and permissible for us to become a viable band are now being shut on us, which is, you know, it makes sense. We should never have been let in the first place, but they're fixing the glitch in the matrix.
I see. I don't believe that. That I don't buy into, that you should never have been, but under the dictates of capitalism, I'm like, sure, the niche, the edges of everything are the first to collapse as, you know, everything becomes a Marvel movie or whatever. Right. But that's just the structures that formed hundreds of years ago that we can't really do much about.
No. And that's the thing, is it really was a moment of great surrender, like ultimate submission, and admitting that you are powerless, like nothing you can do. No matter how good your record is, no matter how many good reviews you have, no matter how many awards you've won, it doesn't mean anything. You know, like it's really like, it really is this sort of like dream-like existence to get to be in it. And, you know, that was a moment where it was just like snapped awake and been like, oh my God, what was that? But so to be able to come back to it, I just feel like no other way to put it, but like agnostically blessed, you know, like I feel like there's a real sort of like Scrooge on Christmas Day moment of waking up and just being like, I get to do it again. You know, I get to be grateful to do it again. And, you know, it's kind of, as much as I still miss the family and things like that, there's a understanding of they're okay with me leaving and they're actually proud of me going away and doing this. And that was something I only really got to understand by spending hours trying to homeschool them or all sorts of things I'm not qualified to do, but spending time and really getting to know them and getting to go away again and do this feels really like, as I said, a blessing.
The way you described like previous albums and things like that, do you think you are still, this is going to be a weird way of phrasing it, but I think there's something there. Do you think you're still in a dialogue with albums you've created, with art that's already kind of calcified? I'm curious because I was thinking in my head, I'm like, oh, you know, you do a podcast, right? That like similar kind of themes to things that I'm talking about. I remember listening. This is a bit of, I guess, professional jealousy, but like Mac McCon, Superchunk and Pavement are like the bands for me. Like I was 13, 14, like when they hit, and I'm like, and Mac was on like early in the pandemic, and he was perfectly nice, and we had a great conversation. But I want to come out of that like he's my friend, and it was. That was a crazy thing in my head. I don't know why. I know.
I asked me at CM Punk when I interviewed CM Punk. I felt the exact same thing you're describing.
But so I went to listen when he was, and I'm like, oh, you guys are having like, you guys are friend, like there's it's popping. I guess there's a lot going on, and I'm like, I like wanted that interaction.
Yeah,
I was like coveting.
I definitely get that. I definitely get that.
And I'm curious if like I have like my story about myself and about previous phases of my life and like art I've created and stuff. It's almost calcified in a way because I've had to like figure out ways of like easily delivering that information to people as I talk, and even to think about like, if I'm going to ask these questions to people, what is it for myself? And I don't know if I'm interacting that much outside of like therapy with that kind of stuff. And I'm curious if like how you like interact with your past, if it has become a calcified thing that you're just like, well, that's it. And now I'm on to other things. Or if you are interacting with previous like things you've made and even like yourself in previous stages.
I think like I have to kind of, just because of, the other stuff with Turned Out a Punk, and kind of constantly looking and reevaluating and reassessing where I am and what I've done. And, we go back and we replay old records, like doing David Comes to Life on this last run, especially like the first day of the first tour for David Comes to Life, our friend Dallas Good passed away. And, it just made every night playing that record really fucking hard. And I'm glad I don't have to play it again. So you're interacting with it and you're relating to it differently, and I think that's the thing is also with Fucked Up, a lot of it is led by Mike in a lot of ways. Creatively, he's the guy who's kind of driving things, and, the guy who's constantly sort of writing and making the band happen. So with him doing that, I feel like I'm constantly surprised by things, and sort of I'm constantly kind of going back to things and revisiting it and being like, how did I relate to it then with my personal baggage with Mike and stuff like that, and how did that affect the project and stuff like that. So it is like, weirdly, I spend a lot of time navel gazing, I guess is what I'm basically awkwardly saying.
Do you think it's like an active navel? Okay, I guess this is the thing. I'm like, is it an active navel gazing? Is it a dialectic? Are you looking back and then changing based on that in the now?
Yeah.
Or is it just like, okay, that's what it is, and now I've got a better analytic understanding of that stage of my life?
No, it definitely is a change. It changes the way I act now. Like the looking at songs that were rushed, or songs, that I wrote from a certain emotional standpoint versus another emotional standpoint. And then being like, well, how could I approach it differently? And like, I think specifically with writing songs, like at different times in my life, I made myself believe that Fucked Up was kind of a burden, and the process of making art became almost a labor at certain times. Like writing David Comes to Life specifically, writing Glass Boys, it felt like I had to do it. Like it was this sort of like burden of atonement that I had to put out this record to atone for just not being a good punk, or not being loyal to my 14-year-old self in the way that I thought I was at 33. That was like 33 was a rough year for me. But then I think this, approaching the record this time, there's like this sort of, once again, I was like gratitude to be able to do this, and just sort of like, okay, well, I'm not going to make the mistakes that I made on this record, or I'm not in the same emotional place that I was on that record. What I'm at now is sort of like a pure love for that I get to do this, that I get to be that person, that I get to be that person who gets to do this. And that's such a unique thing that I just don't know if I had the moment to sort of stop and appreciate until I was forced to stop and appreciate it.
I think it's also like a middle-age thing. As I'm like getting into this, like into middle age, I was talking to a friend of mine who was in a punk band and has then moved on to comedy, kind of like made the same trajectory that I did. And we were realizing that like, oh, we're doing the thing that we wanted to do. And that whatever kind of like negative feelings, either professional jealousies or just like, well, I want this other thing that I should be doing. I should be staffed on a show, not just developing a show or something like that. Right. It's like, well, we're doing it, whatever the thing is we want, like we're doing it. We may want other stuff, but like you need to kind of like stop we all have, this is my theory, we all have voids inside, and we got to stop facing the void. This is I'm honestly, this is a terrible metaphor, but like stop facing and just kind of like be like, okay, the void's there, but we're also, there's other stuff there too. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, totally. I think I think like ultimately, even the reason people get into punk is they're trying to fill that a void, and I think reason people get into sports is they're trying to fill that void. I think like ultimately the void we're trying to fill is like, what do we do in between survival and death, like in what
yeah, that's a great.
like what are we going to leave behind, like what are we, and these are struggles that everyone has. And I think the great thing about punk and hardcore and by extension indie rock and any music that kind of came out of this sort of idea that you can create your own legacy and you can make your own legacy. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in starting a band, it could be in like starting a record label. It could be in, like the impact of Superchunk is massive. Obviously one of the greatest bands of all time. Like I would say one of the greatest pop punk bands of all time. I don't think they get the credit for being a great pop punk band that they deserve. But at the same time, the impact that they had as people that ran a label is arguably greater. And like Neutral Milk Hotel records are just about to get reissued. It's like those things are massive in their impact and stuff like that. So, you can have an impact in a lot of ways. And I think punk gives you permission to start a zine, start like a podcast, start whatever you want. And it's valid because, who's this, this is a music that the greatest records of all time were written by people in their early 20s and teenagers. Like amateurism is almost, coveted in punk.
Did you go in to making music with these ideas in mind? Did you have legacy in your head? Did you have like, I'm always very curious about like, okay, there are plenty of people who are fans of music, or fans of art or whatever, right? And then they just appreciate art and then they go do other things, right? I've always, in the last 2 years, I think I've been really kind of like trying to figure out for, obviously there's no like answer for everyone, but like for every person I talk to, like what is why go make it? Like what was in your head? Can you access that? Can you remember it?
Yeah. Like I think, the original like first bands I wanted to do, it's because my friend Simon Ennis, who was my best friend at the time when we were 13, we were just getting into punk. He had this punk band called The Band that was way ahead of its time in terms of like, they were like 12 and 13-year-old kids playing. Maybe they were a little bit older, maybe 13, 14, but they were playing like Cramps covers and Stooges covers. They were awesome. And I was like, God, I want to do that. So I signed up for a battle of the bands under a bunch of fake names with a friend of mine. And one was You're in Trouble. And they called You're in Trouble back and asked us if we wanted to play the battle of the bands. And so that was kind of like just out of necessity, the band had to form. But I think once Fucked Up finally formed, and they were formed before I was in the band. Like Mike and I lived in this house. Sandy lived there for a while on the couch. Jonah lived around the corner. Josh eventually moved in there when I moved out. So it was kind of like I guess a fucked up house in some sort of weird way. But before Fucked Up form, when it was just Mike and I, it was like hardcore university. We just like obsessed over punk and worshiped it and studied it. And so, yeah, we always had legacy in mind with the band, weirdly. But what that legacy was constantly changing and not constantly, but changing over time. At first we were obsessed with like these obscure hardcore bands and punk bands, like Killed by Death bands, bands that did like one single and then disappeared. But like, it's like the one single that's like the greatest 7-inch of all time. Danger House Records. We were obsessed with Danger House Records. And so we wanted to be a band that put out one cool record. And our first record wasn't that great, but our second record we thought was super cool. And we're like, okay, if we just wind up doing this and that's it, that's amazing. But then, Police begat Bane the Public, which begat, what was the next one? Some other one, which begat some other one, which begat some other one. And then, here we are all these years later with LPs and 7 inches. And yeah, it's just, it's wild. Like to kind of eventually find yourself in a place where you're like, well, I guess we're not going to be that obscure band anymore. We're going to be a band that's going to have a little bit of a footnote in this history that we love. And I think that's all we wanted, that was, I think that was our number one dream.
Was there, I'm going to create a binary. It may not be, but like, and it may not even be these things that I'm saying, but was it like at some point, is it just momentum? Is there intention there? Like what? How is the in your own head or heart? How is this movement going from this original feeling you had when you were 12 or 13?
Well, I think for when I was 12 or 13, that was just like, being a fan of the music and wanting to be around it. And I was in like dozens of bands as a kid. Like I was constantly trying to get in bands with friends, but I don't have any talent in music. Like I don't have rhythm. I can't play a guitar. I can't do any of this stuff that you need. But I've got like that gaping hole that makes me be a lead singer that you need. Like I think that's the thing. Lead singers need to have a certain combination that makes them want to get up on stage and make a fool of themselves. And I definitely had that.
Okay, wait. Can I stop you for a moment?
Yeah.
We can get back to the intention momentum question, but
yeah,
that really brings up this kind of like, because I am a shame-based person. There's a reason why I eventually gravitated to be a writer. I'll make this very short just because I've said it before on the show, but like my wife and I sold a show, this is years ago, and it was about our relationship. She's an actor and a stand-up, so it was obvious she was going to play herself. And I was like, well, this was for Comedy Central, and Comedy Central comedians play themselves all the time. And I'm like, well, I'm an improviser, so like obviously I should play myself too, even though I'm not a front person. I'm not a front person. When I was in a band, my stage patter was terrible. Anyway, the point is, Naomi was like, hey, Comedy Central doesn't give you, like, you don't get a lot of favors. If you want to, like, this is going to be a big ask. You got to really ask yourself, do you want to do this? And I like had to have this, dark night of the soul where I'm just like, could I really pull it off? I can't. And I had to come to the conclusion. I can't, there's no way I can be like, I can be like a store clerk. I can be something that doesn't require you to have to like emote and, I have too much shame. It's a force shield around me. I don't know if you do or if you get past. You obviously, if you do have shame, you get past it. Because go on.
No. I think I do have shame, but in the performance space, and I credit this to like seeing wild art. Like I was very lucky to have access to seeing like Kembra Fowler performances or Hated so I knew anything I did was not going to be past a certain line that people have taken this thing before, but I knew that the door was open to do anything on that stage, like to myself. I never really wanted to hurt anyone else. I certainly didn't want to do a Gigi Allen, but I would, I would like, do like, blade jobs to myself or, which is when you cut yourself like a wrestler does or like smash myself into chairs, like do all sorts of silly stuff because to me, it was all like, there was no shame in that because it's part of this performance. But I think like what makes that, like you're saying, what makes you want to get up there. It's like interesting because Mike from Fucked Up, we both have anxiety disorders, but his one manifests itself in him kind of coming off like an asshole to a lot of people, right? Like he comes off very quiet and guarded and like, and he comes off to an asshole like me sometimes, right? And it's only recently that I've kind of come to understand this as being an anxiety disorder, much in the same way I have it, but my one makes me want to like explode with joy and just over emote and just have my panic attack on stage was my stage performance. Like I would just have a meltdown on stage for people. And just, that's how I kind of dealt with the anxiety, is just sort of like, fuck it, burn it all down. Let's just go crazy. Like I'm going to slash my forehead open. I'm going to be bleeding everywhere. I'm going to be grabbing people in my underwear. Not grabbing people, I mean, but like picking people up wrestling style in my underwear and like doing all this wild shit. And like, it's because like what I will do the worst that can happen. Growing up as a fat kid, I was afraid to take my shirt off when I started having sex. I was afraid to take my shirt off when I went swimming. So I'd go on stage and be like, okay, well, I'm a fat kid. Here I am. I'm naked. What are you going to do? Like, what's the worst that's going to happen to me up here? And it was kind of liberating and freeing when I finally kind of began to look at the stage as being a space where that could kind of happen.
Did you come to that consciously, or is it just that once you entered into this performance space, it just kind of naturally like your body took over. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like I think that's it. It kind of like, I don't know, like there were kind of key moments. Like we played a show one time, and the drummer of Limpress, who's a buddy of mine, grabbed my shirt and ripped it off. And I remember being mortified. It was in Albany. I'm like, oh fuck, I think like the whole world's gonna melt. And I remember that show very distinctly. And then we played a show, I'd say about 8 months later, in Austin, Texas, Chaos and Teos, before it was called Chaos and Teos. I think it was still called Ricky Fest. And Scott from Limprist, coincidentally, came up to me and he goes, and him and Martine from Limprist were like, "You look really good with your shirt off." And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "You look really good with your shirt off." And no one had ever said that to me, right? Like I always felt mortified about the idea of taking my shirt off. Mm-hmm. And it was like 8 million degrees in that venue that night. And I got on stage and I was just like, well, fuck it. And I took my shirt off, and it was this sort of like, I think it was a real turning point in Fucked Up, where it went from like me trying to be a front person in the mold of older hardcore groups to me being a front person and being like, well, let's see where this fucking goes. Like, let's see what I can do with this thing. Let's see. Like, I remember like I remember we were playing a festival in England in a tent, and I got everyone in the festival tent to leave the festival tent with me. So the band's just playing to an empty tent. Now I realize this makes me an asshole to the band, and I do apologize to them profusely for this on a regular basis. But also the idea that I got to do that was amazing to me, you know, or just like going into the back and like hanging out and like high-fiving sound people or people that were unable to get to the front of the club or the front of the venue, or lying on the bar, pouring candles on myself when we were playing club shows. Like I love the fact that I got to experiment like that and kind of like break down the idea that this makes you a god because you've got a machine that makes you loud and a stage, to kind of paraphrase the Canadian Subhumans. But then, you know, at the same time, I realized now that I'm in a professional band situation, it's also not very respectful to the people in the rest of my band who are struggling to, you know, do this music. So now I'm trying to find, which is also, you know, kept it interesting for myself, like a way of incorporating both. Like, how do I bring that kind of earnest breaking of the quote unquote fourth wall of going into the crowd at the same time that I'm not making a circus that distracts from the fact that these people really take what they do seriously in the terms of the music and stuff. And I want to highlight that because, God, that's the only reason I'm able to do the clown show.
Okay, so how? I was about to ask how, but maybe it should be, did that freedom, once you found that freedom within you in the performance arena, did that leak into your life?
Well, I think it leaks into my life in the sense that I think people treat me differently that know the band. And I think it creeped in my life because I've always heard, I'm trying to remember who told me this. Maybe I'll just take credit and say I made it up, but no, I think pretty sure someone told me that you stop maturing at the age you become a professional musician at. Like
that sounds like in AA when they say that like you stop maturing once you start to get addicted, or and then like when you're out of it, you're kind of that age.
Well, and you know, not to overstate the, you know, and understate the one, but like at the same time, like I do kind of view it as it alters your brain chemistry, you know, especially the idea of becoming a professional musician, the idea of getting paid to do what you love and what we all love. Like, it's just such a 1 in a million opportunity that I think it is kind of like some sort of drug in the way that it does alter your brain. And you can kind of see that in people that are musicians for a long enough period of time where, you know, and I know this from big rock stars. Big rock stars, way, way bigger than my little ass. But, you know, like the criticisms and the shit talk still hurts, and hurts in a way that, like, I think most normal people would be like, but dude, just brush it the fuck off. But because of the ego and how the ego becomes an instrument at a certain point for a musician or like a rock star, quote unquote, or professional musician, it should become so frail and become such a thin membrane that protects you from the world around you that you become very sensitive, and you're still sensitive. Like, that's the thing that I find amazing. And like, I'm always like, well, this insecurity that I feel, it would have to go away at a certain point, right? Like, I'll get to this level, and then like, you'd be like, fuck it. What do I care what this fucking asshole says? Like, some random shithead on Twitter says what? Like, who would care? Like, that's got to come at some point, right? And then you meet people that you'd expect would be there. And I haven't met everybody, and certainly not everyone I've met's like this, but a lot of people, it still hurts them in a way that you wouldn't expect it would. So I don't know. I do think it kind of alters your brain chemistry to know that there's people that you don't know thinking about you is fucking weird.
Okay, this is my theory. I only started thinking about this once, like, friends of mine started to get famous, or like, I mean, my wife, again, she like stand up, she's on TV and stuff like that. So like, I see it in these other people. I call them panoptic people. And it's the same for you. When you have this awareness that someone is listening to some version of you, and like, look, listen, whether it's music, a podcast, whatever, the more famous you are, the bigger the chance that someone is listening to some version of you at any moment of the day, right? Mm-hmm. Like Conan O'Brien probably has this feeling that like someone is watching him at any time. And that has to fuck with you, right? That you have this like, that you're under surveillance in some way at any moment of the day. Someone is listening to your music or listening to your podcast at any moment of any day, probably, right?
It was weird because like last night I went to see a show, you know, and I'm at this show with my brother, and you know, Archers of Love, a fucking amazing band. My brother's a huge fan.
Fantastic.
And so I'm sitting there, and it's not like people are bothering me for like autographs or like, but people keep looking over at me, and it's not, and I would be doing it too to like, you know, the guy from The Pursuit of Happiness or Chris Murphy from Sloan, or like, you know, like I'd keep looking over at him too. And I wouldn't be doing it maliciously, but it was just like something that really freaked me out. And I had to go kind of like duck out. I was just like, I can't be here for this sort of thing. And it was like, I could only imagine if you were really famous, what it would be like. Like, I remember that band Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, their first show in Toronto, being at the show, and Billy Joe Armstrong was there with a bodyguard. Like he showed up, he was just like randomly, I guess, in Toronto, and he came there and he had this big bodyguard with him. And like the punk hardcore kid, because I was very much a punk hardcore kid, despite the fact that I was a Black Rebel Motorcycle Club show. I would normally just be at a DIY hardcore show, but I was decided to go there for some reason. But anyway, I was like, look at this fucking asshole. Like, imagine losing touch like that, you know, and you got to go to a show with a fucking bodyguard, and like, you know, but now experiencing a monochrome of what Billy Joe Armstrong experiences, I fucking get it. It's fucking weird, and it's not natural, and it's going to change the way your brain works a little bit because it's fucking weird.
Now, I got to ask, did anything when you were younger at all prepare you for that?
Probably it should have, because I harassed John Cusack into leaving a Raptors game one time.
How old were you?
I would have been about 15. My friend Cameron Wing had really good tickets through his dad's work for the Raptors. And it was when the Raptors were playing at the Skydome before they even built their stadium. And we went to the game, and we were sat just behind courtside, you know, like the like, and it was like, so it was crazy close, but John Cusack's courtside. And I went to go up to the McDonald's with him. I went to go to the bathroom with him at the same time. Like, we're walking beside each other. You know, I'm just like a Punisher kid. I was getting into punk and hardcore where it's totally normal to approach people and to talk to them about stuff. So I started trying to talk to him, and he's clearly like, you know, obviously now as an adult, I'm like, yeah, why would he want to fucking talk to some fucking random 15-year-old kid who wants to trying to talk to him about the Clash? So he gets in line for McDonald's, and I duck inside the bathroom, and I sit down. I see he's he's gone to the other bathroom because I can see at the Sky Dome, you can see people when he walks down. I'm like, that dude avoid peeing beside me? And so I'm yelling at him, why'd you avoid peeing beside me? Why? So he's probably just like, yo, fuck. Way less harassment than I suffered at the Archers of Lowe's concert. He's probably just like, fuck this, and just like left after a bit.
I gotta say though, if you're gonna talk to him about something, talking to like you weren't like, hey, you know, this scene in Better Off Dead. You want to talk to him about music that both of you like. The Clash, like, of course. Why? I don't know. I would say that's on him for not just to a 15-year-old being like, oh yeah, I love London Calling or whatever.
He was, and you know what? In his defense, he probably was like, yeah, man, the Clash are great. You know, like, you know, and I don't know what I expect. I think I know what I expected. I expected him, you know, and this is way less responsible than that Max situation you're describing. I expected him to be like, you know what, dude? You're fucking awesome. Let's do it. You want to come to Hollywood and be in a movie with me? Like, that should have prepared me for, you know, if you're like, if you're going to suffer kids like that at that fame level, it's going to be like, it's going to fuck with you at any level, you know, like I can only imagine what it's like to be that person. That's why when I meet someone who's well-adjusted, who is in the spotlight in some sort of like prolonged way or an intense way, I'm always like, wow, you've managed to do this. And that's why I do forgive the fragile ego thing, because I got a fragile ego and I'm not famous.
Yeah, sure. I get that. I think that it happens to be like, this is my theory. It's not always borne out, but like if you are not born into whatever the business is that you're in, or you don't come from money, you spent more time being grounded. And therefore, by the time you get to become this panoptic person, you had a couple decades at least of being a normal human being. So you realize what it is to be a normal being, or you still have memories of that, and you can hold on to those for a while.
Yeah, like I think like you said, there are people that had to work for it, you know, like I think Bill Hader is grounded. Like when he was on the podcast, the reason he came off to me as so fucking grounded is because he was a PA. He edited like 4 seasons of Iron Chef America. Like he did, like when I say edited, he was like doing like late night trying to fix type stuff on him type thing, you know, like he did the shit jobs you do in Hollywood before you could ever do something that you want to do in Hollywood. So I think it does ground you in a way. I think with me, I do have like these underlying mental health issues that I think did not prepare me for this in any sort of real way. Like I think if I wasn't in fucked up, I think I'd just be like the bitter guy that collected the records, you know, like I'd be the weird anorak guy at the record fair, you know. I do, as much as I lament this band sometimes for, you know, taking me away from what could have been, at the same time, it's like, dude, I fear what could have been. Like maybe you would have gotten your life together, but at the same time, probably not.
Do you think you understood your anxiety disorder when you were younger? We're like around the same age. And I know that like in the 80s and 90s, like mental health issues were like, unless you lived in New York or maybe LA, they were just kind of swept under the rug and you just kind of ignored them.
I was like, Toronto, I think, you know, is New York with training wheels in a lot of ways. So we do have like, you know, and Canadians are going to be very upset when they hear me say that, but Torontonians, the rest of Canada will not, because they don't like Toronto. But in the sense that I think we did kind of have that, and they just never were able to diagnose what it is. And now actually with my kids and going through, you know, kid stuff with their friends and seeing them, I'm like, I probably have something more than like an anxiety, ADHD co-diagnosis from, you know, self-diagnosing myself. But, you know, I've gone to doctors. The only unfortunate thing is at a certain point, the pills that I was on the side effects were just debilitating for me. And I don't think it made me necessarily into a very nice person. And I kind of rejected medicine. This is in a pre-pandemic world when it was still kind of cool to reject medicine before we realized we need medicine to save our lives.
Wait, it was cool in 2019 to reject
I don't
medicine?
mean like I was anti-vaccine, but I mean at the same time I was like, I'm pro-weed, you know, and
sure.
getting off my pharmaceutical prescription much to my doctor's chagrin and much debate with my doctor about it and stuff. Like, this isn't a very pre-legalization. It's so weird because like legalization's here in Canada and now it's like, this seems so quaint, but this is at a time where I was begging my doctor to understand that this weed stuff was helping me and we should kind of move towards for trying to find a way to get it, medically legal for me.
Yeah.
But now I kind of realize like, oh, you know what? Maybe I threw the baby out with the bathwater and maybe there is, maybe I just lost faith in the system because I was finding a quicker solution, which has been the cannabis thing. But I think now understanding a little bit better through raising children and kind of understanding what them and their friends are going through, I'm like, yeah, maybe I should, maybe I should think about going back to the medicine world for treatment as well.
Did your parents, like, was there any kind of recognition about any of this anxiety stuff with your parents, or was it?
Yeah, like I don't think they saw it as anxiety. And then it was, my mom was the one that got me eventually. Like I had like a pretty scary incident where I like freaked out. Like I was, I've talked about this before, but I was in a pretty dark place and my mom, took me to her doctor and then I didn't really connect with him. And then I went to another doctor and sort of found eventually a doctor that worked with me and she put me on Wellbutrin. I was on Paxil. I was on Ativans. I was on chlorazepam in like, acute situations, obviously with those ones. I tried those for about 10 years and then we were on tour in Europe and then I went to weed and it was a very eye-opening experience, but my mom was the one who, recognized that I was in crisis and reached out and kind of didn't reach out, but like dragged me not literally kicking and screaming, but sure, almost to go and talk to a doctor and kind of get help and treatment for it. And now, it was it's been an interesting journey mental health wise, and there's ups and downs, but I think throughout the pandemic, through coming to things like meditation, understanding psychedelics and understanding the use of psychedelics in therapy, specifically psilocybin. But I think I've kind of like, I don't know, I'm in a much better place mentally these days than I was certainly when I was on those pharmaceutical pills. But then also at the same time, I'm like, well, maybe it's because I was on something for just anxiety when it should have been treating myself for ADHD.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember like the first time you realized that you had these kind of issues, even if you didn't know what the word was for it?
Yeah, like I went to go to my neighbor Michael Hagan's birthday party. His dad is in Short Circuit Part 2, Rex Hagan, and was also Pokeroo on the Polka Dot Door. And also on Polka Dot Door. But we went to go to his birthday party, and I remember getting up to his house. I would have been about 4 and or 5, and I got to the front, and him and all his friends were out front of the house waiting to go because I was just lived 2 doors down, and I just freaked out. Like I just didn't know any of these kids, and I just freaked out, and I was like, I'm not going, and like had a fight or flight situation there where I'm just not doing this, like a panic attack. And like that was probably the first time, but yeah, there's certainly like episodes throughout my life that I recognize as being like that. There was like this weird moment where I got diagnosed with a learning disability, but now in retrospect, I'm like, those were panic attacks with when I didn't understand the work and I was overwhelmed with the work situation as a kid. I didn't know how to deal with it, and that's what the learning disability was, more than any sort of typical learning. It ultimately is a learning disability, but then something that's what's classically defined as a learning disability. And it getting that kind of word for what I had and understanding of it was very empowering for me. And in my 20s, like to know like, oh shit, this is what this is. And now I'm on these pills that treat this. And I think like a lot of that shit, the pills made me fearless. Like a lot of the shit I was doing on stage and stuff like that at that time was like just getting up there and being like, well, fuck it. I'm fearless. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, I'm not worried about anything up here. Like, talk about no shame. I had like no shame up there. And I think with cannabis, a lot of people call it that empathy drug. And so now when I get up on stage, it's a lot more of I'm present in the moment and trying to experience everything and trying to experience it with the crowd in the way. And so I find cannabis a performance enhancing drug. The UFC has it banned because they call it a performance enhancing drug for fighting. And so I don't know about that, but I find it a performance enhancing drug for being a lead vocalist for me.
Yeah. It's interesting because I grew up like Ian MacKay's voice in my head.
Yes.
To the point where I was just like, well, I can't do any, like, even like, I don't care what other people do, but I'm not going to, like, I was not really straight edge, but I didn't do drugs and I didn't drink until I was legal. And then even then I can probably count the number of times I've had alcohol on two hands, but like I'm an adult now. I can do what I want. I'm sure that like Henry Rollins and Ian MacKay have had beers and have smoked pot or whatever at this point, but that like it's stuck in my head to this weird degree.
I will say that in my experience, neither one does still to this day. But at the same time, like you're saying, it's so weird. It makes you wonder, like years ago, I read this book, The Passover Plot, and it's sort of this book that talks about Jesus as being this historical figure rather than being sort of this figure from divinity. And like, who would this guy be historically? And it's interesting to kind of think of this guy as just being this person who's like walking around at that time, like not laying down edicts, but just being like, listen, I'm not laying out no set of rules. I'm just saying, if you share food, it's a cool thing. Or maybe if you share all this wine, it'll go further, and you share this fish and bread, and then it becomes turned into a miracle at some point. It makes you wonder if that's going to happen with Ian MacKay years from now. Like, here's this guy because he's the first guy to tell, like, when you go up to him, he's like, no, I'm just telling you what works for me.
Right.
And he does really believe it could work for you. Like, if you follow in his footsteps, he believes, I don't know, I shouldn't say that. I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I asked him one time, like, if he felt there could be another Fugazi, and he still believes there could be. I don't think there could be. I think there were preconditions that allowed for Fugazi to be the Fugazi. Like, obviously, their hard work and their dedication allowed them to be the Fugazi. But, I think when in terms of straight edge stuff, I don't think he was expecting any of us to follow in his footsteps. Maybe when he was first coming up with these concepts, when he was like a little teenager. But I think even by the time SSD was around, he was mortified that people were kind of like carrying this stuff with them as a doctrine in some way. But it's funny how he kind of fills that Christ void. Like David Bazan, when he was on the podcast, talked about him in a way. It's almost like fulfilling this sort of like inner Christ type thing role for people, And it's true. He's the one who tells us what to do morally, like he's the one that has these sort of like, don't drink, don't do drugs, don't exploit people with your casual sex, don't sell out, don't compromise your beliefs, work hard, don't overspend, don't be frivolous. Mm-hmm. Like all these sorts of things that, we carry this shit for life with us, and I find it fascinating because like, this is my new kind of obsession, is this idea of like the people that can inspire with both ways the sword swings, and as much as Ian MacKay is inspiring like a generation of kids, there's also people actively rejecting him that are experiencing inspiration through that act of rejection. Like some of my favorite Poison Idea songs are on that Ian MacKay 12-inch, which is just a shot of their asshole, and like, or Hatebreed. Hatebreed came to existence because Jamie Josta hated the fact that people called Quicksand a hardcore band.
Really?
Yeah, there was an interview with him years ago, and I bring it up to him, and I think he's kind of embarrassed about the quote now. But I've told Walter Schreifels too. I'm like, dude, how amazing is that you were inspirational both ways, because like it's ridiculous and narcissistical to assume that everyone's going to like what you do. Some people are going to hate what you do and not like it, but the fact that they still are inspired to create something that then inspires other people is kind of beautiful. And so even Ian Mackay with people that have rejected him has become this sort of like weird inspiration. Like for some people, he's like the Antichrist, they worship G.G. Allen.
Wait, did you grow up with any kind of religion?
Yeah, I was like high Anglican, I guess you'd call it, which is like kind of like, I guess British Catholic version, English Catholic. It was in my house, and we were culturally Christian, like we had Bibles and things like that. Like I don't think it was ever really, we went to church a little, but it was never like imposed upon me. Like I certainly have friends where I would be, my mom was very, very adamant that there's no reason. Like, I never experienced any sort of, well, before I get into this sort of thing, but I never experienced any sort of the classic horrific realities of sometimes having religious parents or religion imposed upon you. Like my parents were not homophobic in the slightest and didn't ever, say that other religions were wrong. Like it was always a very loving and accepting kind of place in terms of other people's beliefs and values and things like that. So yeah, like we were culturally religious, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like your parents, just from the little bit you've been talking about, we're pretty empathetic people.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Yeah. My dad, his dad died when he was 14. So I don't think I think he, he was always a good dad, like he wasn't always around. My parents got divorced and he moved away. And my mom was a flight attendant, so she wasn't like necessarily always around either. But at the same time, when she was around, very loving, and both of them loved music. Like my mom, when she was 14, there was like an open call on the radio for a TV show called Like Young in Montreal, which is like American Bandstand, but just like a local thing from Montreal. And she went down and auditioned, and she got cast as one of the 6 core dancers. And so she spent kind of her teen years dancing on TV, but like Ray Charles would come in, or she met God, I'm trying to remember some of the names now. She met like everyone, all the big names would kind of come in and play on that show. And so she grew up around music, like The Haunted, this obscure garage band that I didn't even know about. She's like, yeah, I saw this band The Haunted once. And then my friend heard it on the podcast when she said that, and he hit me up. He's like, The Haunt is like the greatest Montreal garage band ever. I'm like, I had no idea who it is. And he's like, I can't believe your mom saw them. That's so wild. And my dad, by the same token, like he went to art school. Actually, no, even before that, when he was 14 years old, like my mom, he drew a picture of the Rolling Stones and sent it to them. And they invited him to come to their practice. And this is Brian Jones era of the Rolling Stones. And he took the train from Portsmouth to London and spent the day, maybe it was like 15, 16, and spent the day kind of hanging out and watched them practice the thing. And then they signed some drawings for him, and he gave them some other drawings and went home. And that was, kind of like when he got into rock and roll. He was into the Who around then too, and saw, and then he went to art college. And by the time he got to art college, rock and roll in the 60s was really in full swing. And so he was booking bands for the entertainment committee there, and booked Jimi Hendrix when Jimi Hendrix was living in England, booked Beefheart, booked Pink Floyd, booked like so many unbelievable music things. So I grew up around cool music, and my parents were always into cool music, but they did not like hardcore. My mom didn't really like punk.
Sure. That's a tough one.
Yeah, but my dad liked punk. He had punk records. Like we had the Sex Pistols record in the house. I grew up listening to Madness and Specials and Ian Dury and that kind of stuff was just like the music my dad liked. He got freaked the fuck out about straight edge. Like I remember the first time he saw me X'd up, he was mortified. He was like, it reminds me of fascism. But that's because he partied. So it was threatening to him that I was saying, and I was saying I had like wild straight edge shirts back then that I was wearing obviously just to shock, but like, straight edge means I'm better than you and all this sort of stuff. So it did have fascistic kind of elements in retrospect, but my dad was very upset by this thing. But it was fantastic because I finally found a rebellion, like that was like mine.
So wait, your dad's British?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he's actually Canadian. he was born here, and then his parents moved back to England. They were both British, but they moved back to England when my grandfather was in the military and sort of stationed over here in Canada when my dad was born. They lived here for a couple of years and then went back to England.
I was only trying to put it together in my head. I'm like, well, yeah, post-war Britain, you are probably on high alert for fascism, and so it kind of like gets ingrained in your head.
Yeah, but it was just it's interesting too because he, I think understood that punk was doing this free interplay of sign and signifier. I remember we went to the Madame Tussauds rock experience in London, and they had a Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten, and he's wearing the Destroy swastika shirt, the Vivienne Westwood design shirt. Rest in peace, Vivienne Westwood. Not one of her best designs, like in respect. And so he's wearing this Destroy swastika shirt, and my brother and I were mortified. Like, the swastika, like, Dad, this is Nazis. Like, what's this Nazi doing up here? And my dad's explaining, like, no, they're doing it, like, trying to explain what irony is to, like, an 8 and a 5-year-old. Like, no, they're, they're not Nazis. Like, they're, this and that. But the straight edge thing he did find very threatening. And it was also around the time that straight edge was receiving, little stories here and there in the newspaper about straight edge gangs. And
wait, what?
You don't remember this?
No, I don't.
Oh,
was this? Wait, hold on. Was this a Toronto thing?
No, international thing. There's a America's Most Wanted episode about Utah straight edge kids. There's also a MTV special about Syracuse and straight edge. And then there was maybe a National Enquirer article, and then there was an article that, not the National Enquirer article, there was another article about straight edge violence in Utah and militant straight edge gangs and stuff that kind of went on the wire services and got picked up everywhere. And it ran here in the Toronto Sun, but it ran in the States too. And it was sort of this sort of very alarmist idea that there's these sober kids, and it was like the time Earth Crisis played on Ozfest.
Okay.
It was this weird moment where straight edge kind of bubbled up to the mainstream, and it feels so quaint in a post CM Punk era where, there's now probably far more kids that have been introduced through the concept of straight edge by CM Punk than were ever introduced to it through Ian MacKaye. Mm-hmm. But it's just, it was interesting at that point. It really kind of bubbled to the surface, and it was all about, obviously the most sensational, violent version of straight edge possible. Here I am, like, just this sort of like, nerdy hardcore kid that likes, straight edge stuff and likes, obviously wearing these inflammatory straight edge shirts, but at the same time, I'm not knocking beers out of people's hands and carving X's into their backs.
Right.
Which is definitely what they said in the article they did.
Okay. The only moral panic that I really remember was the D&D panic when I was like a child. Oh,
I was in that too. I was in those trenches. I was a D&D kid, and it was like a fight for years afterwards. It's amazing how, and you see it like that vape panic that happened just pre-COVID that just now disappeared. But there's sort of these hysteria moments where everyone kind of starts. You can kind of you can just see how we all get enraptured, as a species. And you see it in music too, right? Like we're talking about with the Ian MacKaye, like we put people on pedestals and we like, there's no need for us to do this, no reason for us to do this, but yet we do have a reason to do it and a need to do it as a species.
But is there something, this is going to be really badly formed because it just popped into my head, but because I thought of, and we only have 2 data points here, so there's not much. But like with the straight edge panic and the same thing with like D&D, where these are 2 relatively wholesome activities, right? At the core, right? At the same time, they're also rejecting whatever is in the, I hate using this word, but let's just say mainstream, because I can't think of a better word. It's rejecting mass culture in some way, either because like mass culture is organized a little bit around drinking and bars and things like that, or it's organized around like not being in your rec room rolling dice. These are relatively wholesome things, and I wonder if there's something about like elevating these wholesome things into threats because there's this threatening feeling that they, again, I told you, inchoate badly formed, but I wonder if there's something there.
You're right. You're right. You bring up a good point because they're both ultimately wholesome activities, but at the same time, I think like a lot of the D&D panic was motivated by religion and in a fear of the Satanism of it. And that was going to possess kids, and kids were going to somehow get possessed by this game that, it felt like it was around the same time. Have you ever seen the Canadian movie The Gate?
Yes, I love. My wife and I talk about when the pandemic started. That was one of the first movies we watched together.
Great movie. Have you seen The Gate 2?
No.
So The Gate 2 is the kid with glasses, and now it's all about D&D and the satanic powers of D&D. And it is, I think it's fitting because like we used to have this amazing tape at the video store I worked at. We used to have this like incredible section of Christian videos there. And one of them was, extreme Christian type videos when I say that, and one was this one that was like about all the ways Satan's trying to get to our kids. And they're like, they have this one kid who puts his hands in the muscle position. He goes, He-Man's stronger than Jesus. And the guy's just like, does an immediate cutaway to him just like shaking, like, can you believe this? Like, this is where it's gone. So yeah, He-Man was caught up in it, heavy metal, D&D. I think with the straight edge thing, I think it was more like almost like, ain't it weird? I think for my dad, as someone that partied and rebelled through partying as a young person, because that's like, obviously with the 60s, a lot of it was, I think it was scary and alien, but I think for like I think that's why America Was Most Wanted covered it, because it was almost like, isn't this weird? The most wholesome guys you wouldn't expect. And here's what they're up to. And it felt like, I don't think anyone ever perceived the straight edge thing as a real threat other than my dad.
Okay, then I have to ask, was finding straight edge, was like adopting it into your heart, was that in some way a response to your dad, or was it just a natural like, oh, this is the subculture I'm in and this is what we do?
I think it was a response to like having to get drunk and having to do drugs. And also realizing that, I really liked smoking weed when I first did it. And I think that kind of scared me, and because I was still like in a post drug, like, oh my God, maybe I'll get addicted to marijuana. And I did acid a few times before I went straight edge, and it was awesome. And I think once again, it kind of scared me because I didn't really understand. It was far too powerful of an experience for a 13-year-old, I think, to really process. It's a weird thing being a parent now with drugs, because some of I should keep my voice down in case my son gets home. But it's very weird as a parent now, because you don't want your kid to do these drugs till their brain's fully developed. But at the same time, some of the most powerful experiences that I ever had were while I was way too young to be experiencing these drugs. And some of these very formative experiences, like seeing the Sabotage. I'm going right up to my mic, so it sounds like a Billie Eilish vocal track. I apologize, but I just don't want my son to hear this. But like seeing the Beastie Boys Sabotage video on acid for the first time, that was like a religious experience. Okay, now I can move away from the mic a little bit. Sorry.
Well, then I have to ask, because I have found this, and this is something that I've like kind of realized through therapy, is that like joy feels really. It's not difficult for me to feel joy, but to like really fully experience, like it scares me a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, did you not have that relationship with joy, or what was it like when you were younger? Because it seems like these experiences, when you say, in my mind, religious, ecstatic, it makes me think of like, it's joyous, right? Like, how did you interact with joy when you were younger?
Well, I think I experienced joy pretty freely, I think the thing about the psychedelic experiences is it's to this day, like I still use those things as therapy. Like I think understanding them now, I realize how powerful these are. And I think that's why we're coming back to it in the medical world more and more as being something that is a viable form of therapy. It's because people did this stuff for thousands of years, and like, not to get too, Cheech and Chong philosophy stoner vibes on you, but like at the same time, like I think we and these plants have evolved on this planet together for a purpose, and it's very hard to industrialize and to draw profit out of these things.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason that there's been such a prevention from us to go back to them. Because, weed is something that's been fascinating to see post legalization. Like cannabis flower is essentially worthless now. Obviously super high end strains, but the reality is, like, I got a bag of weed down the corner from my house from a like a quasi legal dispensary, but it was $60 for an ounce. Like, it's ridiculous. But so you can grow your own medicine now.
Right.
You can get this stuff for pennies on the dollar. And when they first brought out medical cannabis, they were selling it for like $28 a gram, $30 a gram for this sort of stuff. And the reality is, these sorts of medicines are things that we can kind of grow ourselves or acquire very cheaply. And I think we're coming back to it now and realizing these things do have value. Coca leaves. When I was in Bolivia, I was filming this thing about pro wrestling in Bolivia, and we were in La Paz, and it was like, people say when you get off the plane, it feels like you've aged 20 years. And I'm like, what does that feel like? And it is 100% what it feels like, because you're so high up. It's the highest capital city in the world. And the air is so thin that just adjusting to that, like being so used to just being able to breathe in oxygen. I've been obviously to Denver and I've been to a lot of places, but just that city, just, they offer, they're like, before we went down there, when we're doing like the flight kind of meeting type thing, they're like, oh, the hotel says they offer oxygen should you need it to help you wake up and go to sleep at night. I'm like, yeah, right. Like, I'm going to need that stuff. And then I get down there and it's like, I need the oxygen. Please, can I have that oxygen tank? And it's not until I found the coca leaves that really things became kind of manageable. And coca leaves there are legalized, and you buy them on the street from people just selling little bags of them. And it's not really much stronger than a couple espressos, but it's a couple espressos that you kind of just chew on and then spit out when you're done. And it's in tea. You can buy teas that have it in it. You can buy candies that have it in it, but really it's these leaves. And it's, once again, pennies on the dollar for these leaves. And like the fact that this can help you kind of get through a day, and it's not habit forming. It's not cocaine by any stretch of the imagination, but it was what got me through this trip. Like, there was I got some like prescription thing from my doctor. They're like, take these pills and this. That made me feel groggy for the whole day and all this sort of thing. Now the coca leaves, that's what works. But indigenous people in that region knew that for centuries and were growing and cultivating this thing and chewing these things. And it was like a part of medicine and a part of just existence, because it was only criminalized because of the United Nations for X number of years. And then when Evo Morales came in and revolutionized the government, from what people told me down there, and changed everything, coca was legal. And now people had access to this stuff again, even though people were saying that it was around all the time, even when it was illegal. But yeah.
Well, I think what's interesting, I mean, what's terrifying, but also interesting, if you just step back from your emotions for a minute about the time period we live in, is that these kind of like crises that are all intersecting in the last like 40, 50 years are opening up certain things that had been obscured before, because there's not enough, God, I always, in my head, I'm like a conspiracy theorist or something, when I'm just talking about large structural things that are happening.
Yeah,
that's all I'm talking about. But like, and as crises, more and more crises happen, when there aren't crises, you can have like a surveillance state that can kind of keep everything down. But as more and more crises happen, they don't have the energy and they don't have the manpower to keep everything tamped down. And so things just erupt in different parts of the globe where it can kind of break through, such as like Bolivia. I'm sure, like, I probably would love, I'm so low energy all the time, I would love coca leaves. I would love chewing, if it's non-habit forming, I would love just chewing one, writing my script and then being able to just relax instead of having to drink like 3 Diet Cokes and then
exactly. Yep.
And like be jittery the rest of the day or whatever.
But that's the thing is like the Diet Coke, you know, they can make money on the marketing. They can make money on the can. They can make money on the other chemicals in it. They can make money on that flavor. They can make money on that sugar.
The flavor is so good too.
I like my problem is and unfortunately it's even like the full bodied colas. I have that's the only thing that I struggle with in terms of an addiction, you know, and I do not crave coca leaves in the slightest, but I crave Coca-Cola every day of my life. And I think at the time, you know, if it was profitable, whoever made Coke, I forget the guy's name, he would have just been like, oh shit, here's just crushed up coca leaves.
Right.
You know? But instead he's like, no, I got to find some way. So he's putting in the sugars and he's putting in all this other stuff that ultimately makes it truly addictive in its own way. But, you know, that way he could, you know, put a little profit in there. There's room for profit with Coca-Cola versus raw cocaine leaves back then.
Yeah. Okay. Wait, sorry. I've kept you too long. Can I just ask?
No, I don't. I got my kids aren't coming home till about 5 tonight. So I got time, nothing to do but chat.
Oh, I just want to ask one more question because you know, it seems like you grew up in a very like open, accepting, empathetic household.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say so. Definitely. Well, until my stepfather showed up.
Oh, why?
My stepfather, that was when everything changed. My parents got divorced and my mom was a flight attendant and she married a pilot. And pilots are interesting. You know, you talk about lead singer psychology. I'd love to do psychology of commercial pilots because maybe it's just the culture at Air Canada or maybe it's just the culture around the people that he hung out with around Air Canada. And, you know, I don't know any pilots now, so maybe it's changed, but it was very, you know, it made rock star shit. It was like if rock stars were all super conservative. So maybe it would be like being on a Ted Nugent tour or something. But, you know, the shit they did, the drinking and stuff like that. I never saw drug use, so I'm not going to pretend like that was a thing. But like the alcohol, and he was not a very nice person to my brother and I. But like, I do have a little bit of empathy for him now in the sense that he was like a guy my age. Like I think he was 42 when my parents got married. Never being with kids. You know, coming into the situation, trying to be, you know, a dad, you know, what he expected a dad. And he didn't have a positive male role model in his life growing up either. So whatever his expectation of a father was, in which, you know, a lot of it was discipline. A lot of it was sort of like imposed, just rules and behavioral things, and a lot of frustration met when we were just kids, just trying to be kids and figure it all out. So my stepfather was definitely when it all changed, which is when I found punk. You know, like you talked about, like, did I need straight edge to rebel against my dad? No, but punk certainly gave me an escape hatch from my stepfather and my brother too. You know, like all of a sudden it's like, you know, he's telling us shit like about, you know, conservative politicians being great. And you're like, I don't know, this doesn't feel right. And then all of a sudden you find a music genre that's like, no, he's an asshole. Like,
right.
You're right. He's an asshole. Like he's wrong. And everything you think is right. And here's this escape hatch under your bed. Like come escape down here. And we're all down here, all the kids, and we can just kind of make our own little family. And like, as much as my mom was always like you know, a loving, supporting, incredible person to us, she was also dealing with her own shit. And in the same way that, you know, punk served a place for me to go for music and stuff like that, it served a place for me to go for family, you know, and meeting Chris Callahan, who then he just finished singing Left for Dead and he was just starting The Swarm, but then he sang in Cursed and all this stuff. He was like a big brother at a time when like I needed a positive male role model. You know, and he was the guy that kind of filled that role in my life, and, you know, in a very direct way, in a very real way. And I'm grateful that I had like those people through punk to kind of be there when shit in my house didn't go as well as it used to.
Yeah. Do you think, this is a counterfactual, so I don't know if it's answerable, but I like asking these kind of questions anyway. Do you think you would have found punk if it wasn't for your stepdad?
Well, because my dad was into it, so I think I was always into punk. You know, I think it was a matter of time about finding the right band. I didn't really like Nirvana when it first came out. But that's because I realized I was a hardcore kid, and hardcore kids didn't like Nirvana. No, I'm just kidding. I like Nirvana a lot now. But
when you say
I didn't
first,
like.
are you talking Bleach or Nevermind?
Nevermind. Like when Nirvana exploded, my brother got into it right away, and I was suspicious because we had been really into Guns N' Roses, and there was big beef between Guns N' Roses and Nirvana, right? And I was like, I don't know, not into this. But then, as I said, I was doing acid. I was smoking weed with my friends around that time. I was around 13, 14. And I met this kid. I got busted by the police for shoulder tapping, which is when you get someone older than you to buy beer for you. And my mom forbid me from hanging out with all my hippie, stoner, druggy friends. And I was like, well, I have no friends anymore. Like, I literally have no friends. So I met this kid who was a skateboarder who smoked weed too. But he was a skateboarder, did graffiti, this kid, Nick. And he was obsessed with Sonic Youth. It was at a time when skateboarders were obsessed with Sonic Youth, I guess. And he got me to buy 1991, the year punk broke.
Okay.
And that got me into punk in just like a Sonic way. Like Sonic Youth clicked with me in a way Nirvana never clicked with me.
Yeah.
And I think so. I think I would have always gotten into punk, but I needed punk then. I would have gotten into it for the music, and I would have probably maybe found a different way to love it. Like the stuff I ended up filing into, like that's the thing I find about punk that's so cool is because, like, okay, you get into punk, like, well, what is it? It's like a choose your own adventure at that point, and there's like all sorts of paths you can go on, right? You can wind up becoming like an indie rocker. You can wind up becoming a goth. You can wind up becoming like someone that's doing some sort of weird esoteric type of electronic music. I wound up becoming a DIY hardcore kid because I was very angry. And I think that is probably a result of my stepfather. Maybe it would have been a ska punk kid if I had a better relationship with my stepfather. I was hearing Madness and Specials as a baby, so it makes sense.
I wonder if that really is the thing. All my friends and I who like got into hardcore, who are still listen to it to this day, there is that undercurrent in our hearts of anger as well. Look, I've been in therapy for 10 years. I have a handle on it now. It's not explosive. I can be in the car and just mutter under my breath if someone cuts me off instead of like exploding, but it's still there.
Yep. I think it's an angry kind of music, right? Like hardcore, the difference between hardcore and punk is like, as much as they're all the same thing and they bleed over and they cross over, but like what defines hardcore is the fact that it was for the hardcore, because I think, like you're saying, it's people that are angry. It's people that need someone to be like, you're right, let's all yell together. Like, let's all like think this is bullshit together and scream about it together and be free and open with our rage. So I think we're more, probably because of this, we're like a little more quick to fly off the handle. It's funny, a friend of mine's in an indie rock band, or more of an indie rock type band, and he got into a recent disagreement with another band they were on tour with, and it became this sort of like big, social media argument between the two bands and texts going back and forth and this sort of stuff. And it was funny because I'm like, it doesn't go like that in hardcore. Like in hardcore, there's a real fear of violence. Like if one band talks smack on another band, there's a possibility of that band showing up and fighting them, and it's so interesting to kind of see like, and when you did diss another band, like even when we would fucked up with diss bands in jest, because we were just like, we wanted to be funny and we thought that was like part of punk rock history was poking other bands and stuff like that. But there was always the conversation of like, well, what happens if this band shows up and fights us? It's like, we're going to have to answer for this because that's what hardcore scarily was, like bands would wind up punching other bands. And it's so weird to kind of like divorce yourself from coming up in that kind of reality and look at it from people that didn't come up through that. And they're like, are you fucking serious? Like, no, that does not happen in a civilized society. You don't worry about that in a civilized society. And I think you're right. Hardcore is very angry, for better and worse.
Okay, here's the real last question then. Do you think you were an angry person pre your parents' divorce or pre your stepdad coming into the picture? Or do you think it's in reaction in some sense to this rupture in your life?
I think I've always been this kind of person. Like, I think the anxiety disorder is what makes me angry, and I think it's that fight or flight internal switch that made me look at the world. Like, there's probably someone who has a different chemical composition in their brain floating around that would have gone through all these exact same stimuluses that I went through and reacted differently, and probably most cases better, but definitely some cases worse. There's some things that this could have destroyed some people, I'm sure too. But in the same way, there's people that go through way worse shit than I could ever imagine that would eat me fucking alive to go through, and they're able to weather the storms. Like, I've got friends that have gone through unbelievable griefs, and yet they're here and they're thriving and finding the joys in life and living this life. And it's inspiring that people do that. And, and I feel like, I feel like I've always been this person, but I'm sure it was, the way it came out certainly was maybe shaped by the stimuluses involved.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, this is what I'm fascinated by. Like, every person's trajectory into this stuff. There's like similar signposts, but every one of those signposts for every single person that I talk to is different as they push them in and yet everyone I talk to ends up making art in some way.
Yeah. Cause I think that's the, I wish I wrote down who said it. Cause I read a quote the other day about how, like, the artists are the closest to madness. Who said it? I wish I wrote it down. And it's kind of like this idea that I feel, like the people that are the most somewhat untethered or have the hardest time tethering to quote unquote reality are the people that are going to produce the art. Like, they're the dreamers. They're the ones that are looking at this from a weird vantage point because they're unable to connect with it in the way that everyone else connects with it necessarily. It's so amazing when you listen to a song and it expresses an emotion that you feel. And you're like, how does this person feel the same emotion I feel? It's because this person, like, an Elliott Smith or someone, like, this person was suffering and they were looking at this world for anything to hold on to. And so they were hitting on emotions that are so universal now because they were hitting on so many different things because they were looking at the world for anything to keep them here.
Yeah. Yeah, and then in some way that anger is because you and I and like whoever like can see, oh, there's a better world. Like, if we did things a little better, if like, things were more equitable, if we lived in a kind of socialist utopia, like, things would be better for everyone, yet we're not doing that. And so that, I think the tension in between what you can see in your brain and reality is where that anger starts to live.
If we all lived in Discordville. Yeah.
That seems like a great place to end. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for doing this. And I appreciate, bearing with me on a weird emotional day.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.